what's up, guys? Basically, we're going to be doing disclosure theory and public forum debate. That's what you guys came here for. That's what you are going to get. I'm gonna try to keep it fast for questions at the end, which means that this lesson will go like somewhat quickly, but it should be fine. I'll send out a quick follow along doc. There's some stuff on the slideshow that's not on this doc, but anyone who wants to like follow along in this chat, you can do that. Ignore the picture at the top of the doc. It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. All right. All right, so we are going to I have access to this the like controls, remember.
I forgot. Yeah, my bad.
You good. Yeah. So we're going to go over what theory is, what specifically disclosure theory is, how you win on it, and then how you answer it. Pretty simple. Let's go. There's some stuff I forgot on the slideshow for sure, so I'll just go over that separately. All right, so theory is an argument that seeks to change the rules or the norms of debate. What does that mean? So, say you're in a normal debate round. You are debating your opponent. In cross, you ask for a card like people always do, and that's fairly normal. Guess what? Their card isn't directly cut from the evidence that they picked up. It's paraphrased. They, according to you, made it all up. I don't like that, so I want to change it. In that case, you could read in that is where theory comes in. Say your opponent did paraphrase something and you think that's no bueno. That means that if you really want to stake the debate and win the debate on the fact that they should not paraphrase, then you can read theory against it. And on judges that will accept theory, you can win it. So essentially, a theory can be split into shells, and within those shells there are a few parts. First is the interpretation, what your ideal debate looks like. So you have to so for example, with the paraphrasing, you could say interpretation, debaters must not paraphrase evidence. So it's with that interpretation, what you're saying is that my idea of what debate should look like is that debaters should not paraphrase evidence. And with this, you should really be specific because people always make these really funny arguments that says, yes, I technically meet your interpretation, or I'm still doing your interpretation because you weren't specific enough. But you shouldn't get a legal team to compile a 615 page interpretation, but it should be specific enough to where it'll be difficult for your opponent to just say, I'm already doing this. This shell doesn't make any sense. And then there is the violation, or how your opponent violated the interpretation. And again, you should be specific about this because similar as the above, it's very common to just see people say, we're not actually violating this. This shell doesn't mean anything. Pretty simple. Standards. This is why violating your norm is actually bad. And these are basically like your warrants. If a theory shell, like if you're going to compare a theory shell to like argumentative structure, which yeah, you should because it is an argument, then this would be your warrants. Like for example, on the paraphrase theory, you could say like there's a very pretty common one called strategy skew, and what that says is that it offers a strategy available to one debater or one team that the other team does not have access to. And this isn't typically read with disclosure, or not disclosure, with paraphrase, but I haven't seen paraphrase theory in so long that I don't even remember. And so the strat skew theory, or the strat skew standard, could be something like, in this case, it could be read as strat skew. By paraphrasing, they're allowed to rework and tailor the evidence however they want, while we are unable to, as we came into this debate with an expectation of only cutting evidence offered to us, something like that. And then voters is, how does the judge signing their ballot on tab room, based on you winning that your norm of debate is good, how does that actually improve debate? And so there's two voters. There will always be two voters, and these are the only two voters that will ever exist. And those are fairness and education, both pretty self-explanatory. Fairness makes the debate space more fair. Education, it makes debate a more educational activity. Next slide. Paradigm issues, what the judge should actually do about it. Now, I did say in the past slide that the voters are what basically you winning the round on tab does for debate, but this is where it gets a little bit more nuanced. So there's three different main debates going on in terms of paradigm issues, and a fourth that I forgot on the doc, but it's in my lecture notes, so I'll go over it. There's drop the debater versus drop the argument. And what this means is it's asking the question of whether the judge should stop the round, or not necessarily stop the round, but basically evaluate the round only on the theory debate and vote for you if you win that your opponent has done something that you think should not be done. Like if you're winning that your opponent has violated your shell, then drop the debater would say that the judge should immediately vote for you regardless of what other substantive arguments are on the flow. And this is pretty much the warrants for this is generally that, or the thought process is generally that the round is too messed up. There's too much abuse that has occurred. And if we were to go back to substance after the theory debate, it would be completely unfair and we can't do anything about it. And this is typically offensive. If you're reading a theory shell, you're typically gonna be the one to read this. Drop the argument. It means that the instead argues that completely ending the round over a single violation is too much, and the only problem is the argument. This is almost always defensive. You will pretty rarely, at least nowadays, you will pretty much nowadays see like nobody reading drop the argument on shells that they initiate. So this is probably something that you're going to be reading to deflate their shells. More on that later. And then there's competing interps versus reasonability. Competing interps states that the best norm of debate wins. If your opponent responds to your theory shell with their own interpretation of how debate should go, competing interps would warrant that the debater who puts forth the best interpretation of how debate should operate should win the theory debate. Pretty self-explanatory. That's how the rest of the debate works. And now there's reasonability, which means that the norm that is the most reasonable to follow should win the theory debate, not necessarily a round, but the theory debate. And it basically means that the judge should evaluate your opponent's theory shell if it is reasonable, if the abuse that occurred, like for example with the paraphrasing, if you were to answer a paraphrase theory shell and read that the judge should use reasonability, that would mean that you paraphrasing is not actually all that abusive, and it is a pretty reasonable practice to like have in public forum debate, which, let's be honest, in a lot of circuits it is extremely common, and if not the norm. And this is always defensive. If you read this on an offensive shell, then I'm sorry, you're doing something wrong. And yep, there's one more. Before I go to the one that I forgot. The RVI, reverse voting issue, and ask the question, should I win if I disprove the theory shell? But wait, that's a defensive argument. And and this isn't saying that you should win on a turn of the theory shell, like just turning the offense on the theory shell. It's saying that you should, just by simply defensively disproving it, that you should immediately win. And that's why it's called reverse. It doesn't make any sense. A lot of judges will not buy it, but the judges that do are that it's a great strategy to have. The team initiating the theory debate never argues for the RVI. Some of the warrants would be like an RVI is illogical, as I explained before. You're voting on defense when you can only vote on offense. It encourages people baiting theory. Now, what this means is that it encourages people to do the most abuse possible just to bait their opponent into reading a theory shell, so they can go all out for the reverse voting issue and win the round only on the reverse voting issue. And you shouldn't necessarily go for it, even though you are responding, though. Typically, the other two paradigm issues are what you should be focusing on. And this is because many judges will not vote on one RVI, just because a lot of the times the warrants for it are kind of shaky, especially when there's more time to resolve the debate and we can go back to substance. For those that will, some of the warrants that exist are like discourages frivolous theory, or a theory that like is just silly. For example, there's a very prominent debater in the Lincoln Douglas circuit who's won a national round with the theory shell interpretation. Debaters must talk about the round in fortnight terms. And it's stuff like that that people talk about when they're talking about frivolous theory shells. And I think that they're really funny and but at the same time, it's like a lot of the time, a lot of warrants for RVIs are specifically saying that RVIs are basically like the counter mechanism to those kind of theory shells without actually having to win just a kind of incoherent debate. And the other is the time skew, because your opponent spends like a small amount of time reading the shell, and then you have to spend more time putting multiple responses on each part of the shell. And that could be a very clear and very reasonable warrant as to why you should win for just disproving the shell, because it also incentivizes them to read better shells. I forgot that. And the last paradigm issue that I forgot on here is the is or it's two things, two additional things. First is spirit versus text, and these two, I don't know what the Norman, I don't know too much PF theory norms right now, but I'm just going to go off of this because I'm fairly certain that this will pop up pretty quickly, and that is spirit versus text. And what this is asking is should you use what the shell's interpretation is intending to have fixed, or should you go directly based on what the text is and only what the text is? And an example of this would be, for example, if you were to read the shell, debaters, I mean, I guess I'll use an example that's relevant to today's topic. Debaters must disclose. Then that shell by itself would very quickly lose to a text debate because it doesn't specify when you ought to disclose. So you could meet the shell by disclosing after the round. But if you were to read, but if you were to win, that the judge should evaluate it based on the spirit of the shell. That mean then the spirit of the shell would probably suggest that disclosure means to send the first speaking case to the opposing team 30 minutes before round through email. And the next one is norm setting versus in-round abuse. This asks the question as to whether theory should be used as a tool to create the best norms across debates or to only rectify abuse in the one round in which the theory debate is occurring. And and this typically goes as follows. I'll just give an example. It's pretty quick. A lot of the times there's not a ton of clash on this, but it's nice to know anyway. An example of this could be like with disclosure theory. If somebody's reading disclosure, if somebody doesn't disclose, they break into AF, your opponents read disclosure theory and then they read a bunch of things that do not interact with case whatsoever, like maybe it's a K or maybe it's a disadvantage that just doesn't interact at all with case. Then at that point, you could read the norms. You could read that the theory shell should be evaluated in a norm setting model because if you're going to read in-round abuse, well, there hasn't really been much in-round abuse considering the opponent hasn't really interacted with the case that they're arguing they should have had access to beforehand. And and typically people who are arguing for only in-round abuse will argue that or I'll start with the norm setting model. People arguing for the norm setting model typically argue that the in-round abuse only solves for one case of abuse at a time, while norm setting actually creates change. And in-round abuse can argue a bunch of like specifics like what really defines norm setting and that norms don't account for the specifics of like debate rounds, like whether you and your opponent are from Durham Academy or from a school that no one's heard of, something like that. Unfortunately, Hansen and Huang are still terrorizing the circuit, but yeah. Next, on the defense for theory. So, quick overview to respond to theory, very quick. Counter-interpretation, you're going to say that the violation that your opponents say that you committed is permissible. Like, for example, with paraphrase, the counter-interpretation, we can paraphrase. Standards, you have to answer theirs, and then you read your own standards as that's, or you don't necessarily have to read your own, but you definitely still have to answer theirs. And you have to meta way if you do read your own standards. Pretty simple. Deflationary paradigm issues. You always want to argue from drop the debater to drop the argument, from competing interps to reasonability, and from no RVIs to RVIs, but only when the judges will buy it. Otherwise, you're sinking 30 seconds of your speech time for zero reason. What is disclosure theory? Okay, yeah, there's five main types. The follow along doc has four main types, but it is five main types. So first is 30 minutes. First speaking team must send case 30 minutes before the posted start time on tab. And standards for this are typically clash and time skew. These are the standards for basically every single shell except for the last one. So yeah, just for clarification. Wiki theory is that teams must have a wiki page on open case list. Open source theory states that teams must upload previous case docs to open case list or like documents of the constructive speech to their case list. Sites say that teams must have sites on open case list. Contact info states that teams must have contact info in a site on open case list. And this one you will typically see a lot of accessibility arguments like trigger warnings, speech speed, etc. So a lot of this might sound a bit weird, but I have an example on the next slide of what a open case list page looks like. If you look at the top with the box that says Harrison round robin and go all the way to the left where you see a blue icon of a page, if you click that button on an actual open case list browser page, then that will immediately download that case that was been open sourced, and that is what open source theory is indicting. The rest of these, this specific debater hardly open sources and for personal reasons, and that's why all of these are blank. Um, the sites, these are typically short snippets of the cases that, like for example, specific arguments, specific contentions, theory shells, etc., that have been previously read. And there's usually always a contact info site. This is what a contact info site looks like. It's typically just like, hey, this is my name, this is my stuff, this is contact info, etc. Um, yeah. And this entire page is open case. And typically in order to disclose, you will send it to their email unless they specifically say their phone to contact like their phone over their email, which nobody does, or some people do, I guess. How to run disclosure theory. You definitely have to read the shell in your constructive. Otherwise, you will waste a lot of time, and judges will be less willing to buy it because you spent 4 minutes not talking about something that should really just be the forefront of your constructive and of your like narrative, I guess is the best way to put it. Because if it really is that abusive, then you ought to bring it up first and foremost. And if you don't, then it looks kind of like it doesn't matter as much. But also, yeah, you just waste a bunch of substance time when you're just really going to be going for a theory shell at the end of the day. And that's just like something that you're losing out on more than your opponent, for sure. Yeah. So you have to extend this shell in every single speech if you plan on trying to win on that shell whatsoever. Otherwise, the shell will die. And basically, like this is just like the same for any argument. You have to continuously extend on the flow, but with theory, you have to extend basically every part of the argument, even if it's extremely brief, even if it's just our interpret. Like for example, to extend the interpretation, just like repeated, our interpretation is to blank, blank, blank. For standards, just like standards are blank because blank. It can be really fast. It can be a 5 minute or 5 second extension as long as you explain it. But yeah, you definitely need to extend the shell in every speech. The judge will not vote on the shell just because they dropped it, and just because they dropped it, especially or like if you don't extend it, because then neither side is technically winning the shell. Be prepared to only debate the shell for the rest of the round. So especially on judges who like RVIs, this is something that you absolutely have to do because one of two things will happen if you don't. If you go for the shell and aren't willing to debate it for the rest of the round, then you either A end up with a shell, you either end up A with a time sunk shell that has just lost you and your opponent time, and guess what? You're probably further behind on substance because you're the one who initiated the theory debate. And or two, your opponent wins the RVI, you forget, and you lose immediately because they won that they should win for disproving your shell. So you definitely want to go as aggressive, or oops, yeah, you definitely want to go hard on the or you have to be prepared to go hard on the shell. If your opponent kind of responds to it well, but doesn't go for the reverse. Okay, so yeah, if your opponent responds to the shell pretty well defensively, but doesn't go for the reverse voting issue, there's a concept that in LD and policy that you can kind of make use of in PF. It's not really like I don't think it might go by the same name. I don't remember. It's called conditionality, where you can just, as the person initiating an argument, just kick out of the argument and like delete it on the flow. It's at your liberty to do so. Like if they don't read RVIs on the theory shell, that and you don't and they responded to it well enough, like if they have extremely good defense on the shell but no RVIs, then feel free to kick out of the shell and actually it's strategic too. So yeah. Um it just jumped. Okay. Wait.
I'm like trying to
Yeah.
let somebody into the Zoom and it's like not okay. Maybe it
Oh,
is.
I got it.
Okay,
I
now
can
it's
do
fine.
the
You're
letting
good.
people into Zoom. Yeah, okay. So don't forget paradigm issues in meta weighing. Again, otherwise it dies. If you're talking about the claymore and impact part of the argument, then the then the standards are kind of both the impact and the warrant, but the other thing is like you're reading this theory shell for it to get voted on. If you don't give your judge any way to actually evaluate this theory shell on the flow, then it's going to die and you're going to be very sad because you just wasted a lot of time and you lost or you either lost or wasted time on a theory debate that you forgot to tell the judge what to do with. Judge instruction is great in any type of argument, especially theory debate, and you have to continuously extend and contest with paradigm issues and meta weighing between different arguments on paradigm issues and meta weighing. So yeah, don't forget that, please. That would not be very cool. Yeah. And finally, leverage any small school aspect you have. It's pretty infamous that like a lot of it's pretty infamous the argument that small school debaters should not have to disclose, or small school debaters should have certain privileges because they are already disproportionately advantaged compared to schools like, again, Durham, or for example, or just people with debate drills, for example. And even if a lot of the times it's extremely hard for judges to actually like make arguments on that. If you win, this goes back to the like kind of niche debate I was talking to you about earlier, the norm setting model versus in-round abuse. If you can win in-round abuse and also leverage any small school aspect or like lack of resources aspect you have, it's pretty easy to win the disclosure shell, especially if you are against a larger team or a team who is on debate drills, for example. Now, if you guys are on debate drills or stuff like that, then you can still win without this. These are just kind of like smaller arguments that you can get away with as small school debaters. But if you aren't, then that is perfectly fine. And if and for responding to it, there's some other stuff you can do, which is right here. Wait, did I? Oh, I forgot to rename the slide. That's what happened. Okay, yeah, this is supposed to be how to respond to a disclosure theory. I basically took all of the lecture notes that I have in chat and just dumped them into a slideshow yesterday because I didn't realize I needed a slideshow, and so I forgot some stuff. Yeah, so if you want to respond to disclosure theory, or I guess if you have to, first is don't burn a lot of time in rebuttal going for it. That concept that earlier I was talking about conditionality, yeah, that also can kind of screw you if you don't, or like if you spend too much time on it, because then you spend all your time on that and all you have left with is just like lost time and your opponent kicks out and beats you on substance. So definitely still keep an eye on substance. It is the default layer of the debate, and if nothing else, you need to be able to win on it at any given time. That being said, you should dump RVI's good warrants if judges are at all open to it in any sense, because in that case, your time is also of a benefit to you. You're not just reading defensive arguments, you are generating offense for yourself by responding to the theory shell. And that is always a good thing. So yeah, um, do that for sure. And in this case, with a small school aspect for responding to it, you can go with the angle that small school debaters shouldn't disclose and the whole in-round abuse thing. If you are from a larger school, or if you have debate drills, for example, a way that you can kind of counter this is with a norm setting model. Like if you have a small school debater basically going with this sort of tricky argument, you can just respond by saying that a norm setting model is the best model that we can use for evaluating theory, and as such, they should still lose on a theory violation for disclosure, even if like in round it's not abusive. They should lose on it being a bad norm. And yeah, another strat is reasonability and dumb on substance. This is goes for basically any shell, but any shell that is generally reasonable. Obviously, if it shells like obviously if it's certain shells, then you shouldn't go for them. If it's like IVI-esque shells, I know they're two separate things, but you probably get what I mean. You probably should not go for reasonability on those, and you should just take the defensive angle, or the less tricky defensive angle. What you can do is you can basically ignore the entire shell, or you should still put responses on the shell. Put a few responses on everything still, but you can put less responses on everything. Use a lot of your time to basically argue why using reasonability to evaluate the theory debate is a good model, and maybe spend like a minute total on that, and then just spend the rest of your rebuttal going for substance. That will put your opponent's fairly behind on substance because to read the theory shell in the constructive is a pretty big time commitment. And so now they're only left with like 2 minutes, 30 seconds to 2 minutes left of substance, whereas you have four. So, and by doing this, if your opponent doesn't respond well to reasonability, then they have permanently lost that 1 minute to 1 minute and 30, or like that 1 minute to 2 minutes of time spent reading the disclosure theory or whatever other type of disclosure theory in the constructive. And the other nice thing about this strat is that a lot of PF judges will be willing to vote on it because a lot of PF judges do not like theory. So this is a pretty solid strategy, I would say, for judges that are down to evaluate it. Definitely uh, look into that. Do not go for drop the argument. If you're, as you normally should, if you're responding to theory and you're in the deflationary paradigm issue stage, do not read that theory should operate under a drop the argument paradigm. If you're running disclosure theory, there is no argument to drop. And therefore, if you read drop the argument, it's an extremely simple run for your opponents to just say, drop the argument doesn't make any sense. And it's just simple as that. Like, yeah, don't go for drop the argument. I don't know how else to put it. It's pretty simple. You will lose immediately. Just deflate RVIs and reasonability. You should be fine. Um, if you do want to go for drop the argument, though, there is one way that you could possibly do it that I could think of, and it's just arguing that drop the debater is a bad norm in general. So if they argue that drop the argument is nonsensical, that just takes the shell away. But you have to be very convincing and have pretty good arguments as to why drop the debater is a terrible norm, which I don't think is extremely difficult to do, but it definitely will take some effort. So also consider that strategy. The slideshow is not a totality. You can go for drop the argument, but you have to go for it as a norm and not as a general thing. Um, hold on. I, I need to wait. Okay, that's fine. We're good. Okay, now offensive counter-interps. This is a very niche strategy. People have referred to it a lot of the times as a poorly warranted RVI, and a lot of the times it is, but it can also be a very well warranted RVI. It just depends on how you do it. An offensive counter-interp is the inverse of the interp. So, like, if we're going to be doing disclosure theory, which we're here, so we're doing disclosure theory, instead of saying that debaters must disclose, an offensive counter-interpretation to that, instead of saying that debaters don't have to disclose, would be to say that debaters must not ask their opponents to disclose. Or I guess a more or less like a more simple case with paraphrasing. You could say that the counter interpretation, if you're running an offensive counter interpretation, would be that debaters must paraphrase. And these a lot of the times can seem pretty silly, and that's because they definitely are. And they are definitely silly arguments, but silly arguments win all the time in debate. These can be very well warranted. These arguments can actually be pretty decent sometimes. So yeah, they are the pros of these arguments is that they're a lot more aggressive, meaning that a lot of the times when you're responding to theory debate, to win the shell that your opponent initiates, you generally have to win an RVI, and most judges don't like that. But in the case of an offensive counterinterpretation, you can either win the RVI or just win your own shell. And on top of that, it can catch opponents off guard because they're probably used to responding to neutral statements like debaters don't have to if they don't want to, and not that debaters must do the opposite of what they're suggesting. This can definitely catch your opponents off guard, maybe during their prep time at worst, and possibly cause them to lose their round at best. And yeah, so they look very appealing. However, it is important to remember that a lot of judges aren't huge fans of offensive counter-interps, and that means that they are both harder to warrant, and judges will have a harder time voting on them just because they don't really feel like doing it. So yeah, so what is the takeaway with offensive counter-interps in general? Ask your judge beforehand if they are willing to evaluate an offensive counter-interpretation, especially if your opponent is has in the past read theory. And if they say yes, then great. You've got a pretty tricky, pretty curveball-y strategy that can take your opponents out. And if they say no, then that's perfectly fine. Yeah. Instead of that, just go for the other strategies, whether it be just drop the debater as a bad norm, reasonability, takeouts, and then go for substance, or just any other strategies that you might happen to come up with. An offensive counter-interpretation is not the only way to catch your opponent off guard, but it is definitely a strategy that not a lot of people expect, and that can be very strategic at times. Questions? I'm open for questions. Oh, I mean, yeah, this doesn't have to be topical to the lecture. I can just do any questions. How do you respond to a K? Okay, so there's an acronym that a lot of people use. It's called F postal, and it basically just takes the K and boils it down to an algorithm that makes it a lot easier to respond to. The F stands for framework. Framework is just like basically every K will have a framework that tells the judge how to evaluate the round from then on, because Ks typically do not follow a traditional model of debate, and as a result, the K debater in question will have to tell the judge how specifically to evaluate the round. So, for example, I'll get to the RVI question after. Oh, those aren't Ks, those are identity tricks. Identity tricks, you can go onto the Open Case List website and find a shell that says race bit. You can either come up with a theory shell that says that race-based burdens or like gender-based burdens are bad, or you could just basically just there's another argument to that that's along the lines of like by perpetuating giving minorities, whether it be racial or gender advantages in debate, it makes their advocacy weaker by making their message seem like it's only a good message because of their identity, not because it's a good message. Like them getting the ballot based off of just being female dilutes their message of feminism, for example. Okay, yeah. So the RVI. Basically, an RVI is an argument that says if I say that my opponent's model of debate is bad, then I should win the round. Even if I don't give a better way to like evaluate the round or a better norm for the rounds, then I should win just by saying that their norm is bad. Can you drop the debater is bad for responding to a theory? Okay, yeah. So for drop the debater is bad, typically what you want to that it's a fairly nuanced strategy. So what you do is you respond to if your opponent reads a theory shell with drop the debater as one of the paradigm issues, then you can come up with an argument, and I'm sure I have warrants for these somewhere. I'm not sure where, but that basically says that drop the debater is a bad model of debate. Basically, like having a theory shell and having it instantly win the round for you or your opponent, that is a bad model of debate, and the judge should under no circumstances do that. And so where this comes into play is that if they concede that drop the debater is a bad norm and the judge should never drop anyone just for a theory violation, that means that if they argue against if you drop every other part of the shell, say you don't respond to any other part of the shell, and you only respond to drop the debater is a bad norm, and they go for the shell, like they say they've conceded the shell, we should win on it. Then you can go in the next speech and say that your opponents didn't answer the fact that dropping the debater for a theory norm is a bad model of debate, and so the shell shouldn't mean anything. It's basically a way to take out the theory shell a few speeches after you actually respond to it, if they go for it. Should you try, do you have to prep a theory file? Yes, you do. Typically, you will have to prep a theory file. You can kind of make improv theory shells. I've done it in the past. You do need some, you do definitely need some experience to do that, though. And you should have paradigm issue warrants and voter issue. Like, you should have standards, paradigm issues, and voters prepped. But the actual interpretations and violations you can extemp in round. Disclosure theory by disclosing or preparing a counter interp. Typically most debaters will just disclose. It's really not that big of a disadvantage to you if your case is good. But I would say if you are reading a KAF or if you're breaking a new affirmative case or just a new case in general that you haven't read before, it's strategic not to disclose because your old case is already on the wiki. And in that case, it's better to just prep new responses to disclosure. How do you give counter framework? How do you run counter framework? The easiest way that I think that you can do that is you have to find a way that your framework explains their framework and also does something that the framework doesn't. Like with the one that you're talking about of just the word you're looking for is like maximizing expected well-being or utilitarianism. The best warrants for that are that utilitarianism explains every other system, but because humans operate on a pleasure pain system and their system is really only just trying to minimize pain of certain minority groups, but that still falls under maximizing expected well-being. So yeah, you really just want to say that your framework explains theirs and is also better than theirs in general. That's just two things. So, and what that does is that means that you're not losing anything by following your framework, but you're also beating their framework just on your framework being a better value proposition. Let's see. Respond to a shell, which is the most effective? It depends on the round. The method that is best to respond to the shell very heavily depends on the round. I'm a big fan of dumping reasonability warrants and then going for substantive arguments, like basically arguing that reasonability is a good paradigm issue and then going for contention off like contentions basically. When you know to drop substance, you drop typically you will drop substance when your judge is receptive to theory and your opponent hasn't sufficiently responded to the shell. I don't how do you give framework? You just read the framework in the constructive. A new AF is an affirmative that you've never read before at the tournament. Yeah, evidence you can come up with warrants on your own as to why utilitarianism explains settler colonialism. Like you could just say like settler colonialism is non-utilitarian because today we don't practice settler colonial or don't say that, but like say that settler colonialism is prohibited under utilitarianism because that doesn't maximize the well-being of natives or something like that. So that's you explaining it. And then also say their framework can't explain any other types of violence in the world. That's you basically saying why utilitarianism is good, it explains their framework, and also why their framework comes short of yours. Um, yeah, you line by line theory. So reasonability, what reasonability is it's basically saying that the judge should ask the question of not whether is your opponent's norm, like what your opponent is trying to get everyone to do in the round, if that's a good idea or not. They should be asking whether what you did as the person that they're saying did something wrong is reasonable to like respond to or continue the round with. Like for example, uh going back to the paraphrasing theory, if the paraphrasing happened once and it wasn't a misinterpretation of the evidence, then you could argue reasonability and say that the shell is unreasonable and that, or more so that you could say that you are being reasonable because what you have done doesn't really skew the debate. It's perfectly fine. If your opponents don't even attack the theory, you want to spend that entire speech on theory and also explain that theory comes before contention stuff. Um, when do you drop substance when theory is being run against you? You don't, unless you want to read a shell of your own that says that their theory shell is bad, which does exist. Like there are shells called meta theory that basically says that certain types of theory are bad. An RVI is not a theory shell in itself. Um, an RVI is not a theory shell in itself. It's basically a concept more so than it is an interpretation. So you do still have to win the full argument. You have to win, or more so just win reasons why um, RVIs are a good model for debate. Yeah, it's basically just win impacts as to why it's good, basically. because the link and like the link is already implicit. Oh yeah, Eric, we're in questions now. So if you want to send any goofy questions about theory, then you can go ahead. Do you think disclosure theory is viable at the middle school level? It highly depends on your judge. Um, I'm gonna go for the links thing first, and then I'm gonna go to the wiki. So you should not card anything in a theory shell unless you're reading topicality, but that's not relevant now. So don't card anything. You should have contact information, pronouns, and basically just like any sort of accessibility requests. And you should also in the citations, and you should have previous round docs available along with full round reports, and I think that's basically it. Can you run theory on theory being unfair? Yes. Citations, I can't get that. I can't get into that this lecture. Open case list is pretty complicated. Um, let's see. Hold on. Let me get into the Equality in Frontiers Discord to find somebody who could probably work you through that better than I can, just because I think it's kind of weird to explain. Yeah, so if you go to Will Lonely 21 on on the Equality and Forensics Discord, he's on the board of directors, and ask him about like how to use open case list. He'll work you through all of it. Do not read theory and critiques in the trad district, please, for the love of God. You are not going to have a fun time. Um, oh nice. Better to give a procedural. If you're reading something like RSpec or like or if you're reading like RSpec or counter solvency advocate theory or something like that, then I would say definitely go for a like full education push because that directly turns the role of the ballot, which basically gives you extra offense. I would say in general though, you want procedural fairness unless you're reading like an identity-based shell, in which case definitely full cross structural. Also, I don't think it's really so much with the role of the ballot being based in epistemology. I think it's just if a decay in general, because if the role of the ballot is basically just like resisting settler colonialism, and in your NC you stand up and basically say that the role of the ballot gets that the role of the ballot like bites itself because they're being uneducational or something, then that's not what they're indicting. They're indicting the actual epistemology of where the information comes from, not that the information exists. Okay, yeah, RVIs, sure. RVIs are an argument that basically just say that if you are able to prove that your opponent's interpretation is bad, then that by itself should win you the debate round. RVIs say that you don't need to provide a better alternative or or basically say reasons why yours is actually good, just that their interpretation does not solve. In PDF, do not read framework. It doesn't matter. If your opponent reads something like structural violence, that's going to be extremely rare and you'll be fine. Oh yeah, sure. Parts of a theory shell. So first is the interpretation. What the interpretation is you saying that this is the way I want debate to be evaluated. Violation is how your opponent makes that dream impossible. Standards are impacts to the shell. Standards are basic. I said warrants earlier, but they're kind of more so impacts. I am not running on enough sleep right now. Yeah, so standards are basically impacts to the shell. Like standards are what is lost by your opponent violating the shell. Like, for example, if you read a standard as clash, that would mean that argumentation and competition is lost because your opponent has done something abusive. Voters are how the judge should like evaluate it, like what voting for the shell does. And paradigm issues are how the judge should interact with other elements on the flow. Whether they should immediately make you win the round if you win the theory shell, or just drop the argument. Whether they should evaluate the best norm, or whether they should evaluate the theory shell if the abuse was reasonable or not, and whether they should allow the side that is defending theory to win by successfully defending theory. RVIs, you should just ask your judge. ROB spec is actually fairly, it's kind of being done, but you can still win on it. Typically, it's a time suck. I would say that like judges are fine to vote on it. There's probably like induction fails where they're not gonna necessarily like it. You might lose like a little bit of speaks, but you should be fine. No, frivolous theory is like Spencer Swickle's Fortnite terms. Um, it's not. Basically, it's just roll of the ballot. It's how you frame the debate. It's how you want your opponent. It's asking the question of what the ballot's purpose should be. It's like the ballot, like as in like what voting for, or like what does voting for me or what does voting for my opponent mean, basically. Does shoe theory in middle school go hard? Frick yeah, brother. How do you rebut frivolous theory? Quickly. You don't want to spend a lot of time on frivolous theory. Please do not spend a lot of time on frivolous theory. You should come up with clever responses. You should try to turn it as much as you can. Definitely read as many link turns as you can that actually are link turns or impact turns, one or the other. Do not double turn yourself. But the two things to remember are respond to it quickly and respond to it while giving yourself offense. Frivolous theory is theory that is basically just like kind of ridiculous and stupid. Do not explain theory to a parent judge. They will not buy it. There is zero chance that they will buy it. I'm sorry. An independent voting issue is a reason why your opponent should lose, regardless of whether of how many other layers of the debate they win. They're kind of goofy arguments. What's the point of drop the debater? It's the point of drop the debater is if theory was too abusive, or like the violation was too abusive, and they should just lose because the round is irreparable. A theory hedge is something that you read in your constructive, or I guess in your case, because I know that you're an LG debater, it's something you read in the 1AC that's basically just a bunch of usually kind of frivolous and tricky stuff that preemptively argues paradigm framing issues, meta theory. So stuff like like for example, yes, like for example, I don't know, no 2NR theory, but yes, 2AR theory, something like that. Um, is there something that goes against RVIs? No, you will have to say that the RVIs are bad. Yeah, typically when people refer to an underview or spikes, it's usually a theory hedge. The only times it's really not is when people are reading substantive tricks, but those are kind of out of the meta now. Like nobody reads paradox of material implication anymore. There's not main meta theory shells. I mean, I think the main one that I'm aware of, like there's no not a main set, but the one that I'm most aware of is like debaters must not, or like the AF must not, or like the first speakers must not read that the theory read in a rebuttal is drop the debater without RVIs and under competing interps, and also that the second speakers don't get rebuttal theory. Basically, just like combinations of paradigm issues. How do you do meta weighing? You pick a metric, like for example, if you're talking about substance like scope, and then if your opponent's arguing probability, you make reasons why scope is a better metric than probability. Like one of the most common ones, especially for extinction, is um yo Eric, can you help me out? What's the name of that util guy that says that util is mathematically true?
I have like no idea. I'm not a
Oh, it's
big
Bostrom.
util
It's
person.
Bostrom. Yeah, there's a guy named Bostrom who basically argues that extinction first is like mathematically true, and that's how you can weigh scope against probability just by saying that even a slight chance of extinction should be enough to completely outweigh just because it has an infinite impact. I think that's basically time for questions. I'm gonna let one more question come through. If no questions come through in the next minute, I'm just going to close it out. How do you determine the arguments for your theory shell? Basically, you just look at what's going on the flow and you see what's the clearest way that you can both win the judge over and also like have your opponent actually violate the shell. It's extremely situational and requires practice.